What's going on, guys? Welcome back to True EV. In today's episode, we're going to be doing things a little bit differently to normal. I'm going to start off with this PowerPoint here, and I'm actually going to give you the exploitative framework for how I think you should be playing the flop as the would-be c-better in fairly soft pools against weakish opponents. So this could be like a bad reg that doesn't really know how to play solid flop strategy. This could be a recreational player. And this is really aimed at those of you who are not battling against tough players on the flop. Obviously, if you're against a strong player that knows how the flop works and is going to play their range in a pretty proficient manner, you're probably going to want to have a more solid theoretically based flop strategy. But what I see a lot of people doing is deviating away from a GTO flop strategy, but in a direction of trying to simplify for themselves and saying something like, well, I'm going to bet all of my range here because that can't be that bad, and people overfold. And it's like, okay, so that's probably an all right thing to do. That might even be an improvement in some spots on playing a GTO flop strategy, or it might not be. But it really misses the point, because in real life, your opponents are reacting vastly differently to a solver when they face a bet and when they face a check. So if we were to look at a sim here, let's say, for example, a spot like blind versus blind on the flop, and we were going to look at a board like, let's say, this one, which is 8-5 deuce rainbow. And if you look at our strategy here, we are, it's no coincidence that we are indifferent with every hand pretty much in this range, with the exception of like some really, really mediocre showdown value and the exception of like some really terrible trash, maybe. But for the most part, we are just super indifferent here. Even if we have a hand like the Queen 9 of clubs, if I draw your attention to this one, we're here with this hand and we're thinking, okay, we could c-bet or we could check. And if we know how the theory works here, and we know that if we bet, they're supposed to raise 13% of the time. They're meant to be raising us with a bunch of semi-bluffs. If you're playing in a weak pool, you're not going to get raised 13% of the time. You're going to get raised less than that. You're going to get raised less than 10% of the time. In many pools in position in a spot like this on the flop, your opponents are just simply going to be calling or folding for the most part. To think that people are only folding 9% of the time is obviously absurd here as well. This is a hugely overfolded spot. So does that mean that you should bet your range because it's an absurdly overfolded spot? No, it doesn't. It means that the best strategy is actually to split your range intelligently using different actions with different combos in order to maximize EV. So if we return to this hand for today, which is the Queen 9 of clubs, and we see that this is a hand in our own strategy that we can mix between betting and checking, and it has exactly 6.13 chips out of a pot here of 60 chips, whatever we do, then we're in a situation where we should be indifferent in theory. But in practice, we know that betting has just absolutely skyrocketed in EV because we know the fold equity is better, and we know that checking is actually not going to do so well by comparison, therefore. But also, checking might not do so well just even directly, because when our opponent bets third pot here and we have Queen 9 of clubs, we're actually just meant to fold. Like, we don't have a choice in equilibrium. It's now slightly losing to call, but it's only slightly losing. And we probably should defend now in real life, because people stab a bit too wide when checked to. They're very, very bet happy against a check, but not that raise happy against the bet, which is why you see people jump to this conclusion that just range betting must be the best thing to do. But actually, that misses the point. So while it is correct to bet with Queen 9 of clubs here, and that's going to be really, really high performance as a line, if you imagine you actually had a good hand here and they're grossly overfolding but also stabbing a lot, well, imagine you got here with pocket kings. And again, you're allowed to mix bet and check. Of course, this time if you check, you're mostly just going to be check raising, although a bit of slow playing going on here as well. Wouldn't recommend that quite so much in passive micro stakes and low stakes pools. But the point is that when you bet, again, your opponent's just meant to almost always continue. They're meant to fold only 9% of the time, so betting kings is fine, but in reality, you probably get a fold like a third of the time here. Like, it's a grossly overfolded node, so when you bet your kings, you just do less well, but when you check, people are betting too wide, too merged, betting too many pairs, not checking enough 5x, not checking enough 8x, not checking enough pocket 7s, pocket 6s, even betting too much with hands like king queen that are pretty mediocre, and they're just kind of like showdown value / semi-bluffs. And what you're going to see is that you face that bet so often that check raise just starts to outperform bet, given that bet is overfolded. So in this framework, I'm not going to dive into any more detail with the sim, but in this framework, we're going to go through some rules for identifying what we call the compartment strategy versus weak opponents. So this is where we outline the blocks of our range and what they want to do exploitatively. So instead of just saying, okay, we're going to simplify and make our own lives easier here and just bet range or check range or whatever, instead we're going to move towards an intelligently exploitative strategy that tells us what to do with each compartment. So given the reads that we've just outlined here are utter trash on an awful board, is about the only thing I'm happy check folding against what's generally an overfolding pool. So the 8-5 deuce Rainbow. That wasn't an awful board. That was a board that was relatively okay. Small blind's going to have a bit of an EV disadvantage, but nothing major. And although we're meant to normally play a lot of check there, we reasoned that bet was going to be really great with hands like Queen 9 of clubs or kind of semi-trash or semi-prosperous type stuff. When the board is truly awful for you, like it's 6-5-4 or something, and you have a terrible hand, like a really, really bad hand, like king, deuce, no backdoor flush draw, check folding is permissible. Like it's okay on 7-6-5 with king deuce or something like that. Maybe not 6-5-4 with a gutter. And it's permissible because although pool does overfold to bets on almost all textures when you're playing low stakes or micro stakes here, you're going to find that like some flops are just dreadful. So the only time I'm really happy adopting a check fold plan against a weak opponent, blind versus blind, is with a terrible hand on a terrible board. The other situations where we have semi-trash or utter trash, when the board is not awful, we should just bet. So when we land on the 8-5 deuce board with the Queen 9, that's not even really semi-trash, it's getting a bit more prosperous than that, but it's somewhere between semi-trash and like an okay semi-bluff. We should definitely go ahead and bet that hand against the soft pool. 50 NL, 25 NL, whatever you guys happen to be playing, you should be betting that hand against your average opponent, reg or recreational, in that pool. You shouldn't be check folding. I see a lot of my students, when they first show up to me for coaching, check folding a hand like 10-9 on a board like Jack 4-3. And it's like, okay, like in GTO, that's fine. Like you can check fold 10-9 on Jack 4-3, but your opponent's calling and raising you enough to neutralize betting in GTO, and that's not happening in reality. So when you check fold 10-9 there, not only are you probably facing a stab too often, but the overfold and under raise that's occurring is really, really chronic and, widespread throughout the pool. That's something that's not that likely to change in the near future at low stakes and micro stakes. And this is indeed how we get through these stakes, is that we try and play a lot of nodes exploitatively. Not just the river, like we've been looking at mostly in this course, but also just like right from the get-go, we can be playing exploitatively. So whose life are you really making easier when you bet your range? Like who are you really doing a favor to when you bet range on Jack 4-3 because you know that people won't react well to it? Is that making your own life easier? Yes, sure. But is that also letting your opponent off the hook? Yeah. So if you have a good hand, you might want to consider slow playing. That's the idea. When you have a highly vulnerable, thin value hand, like a hand that's not amazing, that's really vulnerable, that just wants to get money in immediately and get a little bit of value but deny equity, you should probably bet. Like I wouldn't put that in the slow play bucket. But when your showdown value is more stable, you're up at like second pair, there's only one overcard, it's unlikely that your hand is going to be fourth pair or worse by river. This sort of holding, that's a good rule by the way, the fourth pair or worse rule. So if you have like a 3 on a board like 10-8-3, you might just consider betting because by the river you're going to have fourth pair or worse. But if you have Jack 10 on Queen 10-7, you may well consider checking there against a weaker opponent and just let them bet in a chaotic way. Let them bet in an unstructured way. You know if you bet, they're not going to call you or raise you that much, so your thin value isn't really there to as much of an extent. So with the more stable stuff, you can definitely just check call. This goes for weak top pair, under pairs, good ace high, like on the 8-5 deuce board. Ace king is meant to value bet really often, but you might just want to check call if your opponents are going to lose control and just make loads of bad bets. That's going to really help ace king as a check call there. Prosperous unmade hands are going to check raise, usually, although you can bet depending on how aggressive your opponent is. One kind of sweeping caveat that applies to all of these spots would be that if your opponent's hyper passive, you should just be betting your good hands and not really allowing pot stagnation to occur. And if your opponent's hyper aggressive and is going to be a pain and will stick around and raise you a lot, you might check fold some bad hands and you might slow play even more of your good stuff, and you might check raise even thinner for value and stuff like this, right? Or check call hands that would normally check fold or bet. So there are things you can do against very aggressive opponents and very passive opponents, but for the most part, this guide will stand you in good stead on the flop, blind versus blind. So if you have a prosperous unmade hand, that means something like a really good pair draw with, maybe a gut shot or backdoor flush draw. Maybe not, maybe it's just a really good pair draw. Like I don't mind check raising queen jack on 8-7-3. I have no problem with that at all. Against pool, you have backdoors galore, you have nutted pair draw outs, you're doing really well when you improve. And your opponent's going to bet chaotically and fold a lot. So going for check raise with queen jack backdoor flush draw on 8-7-3 is no problem at all. Another example of a prosperous unmade hand could be a flush draw, straight draw, open ender, gut shot. Lots of things like this. Something that's lacking showdown value, such that if you start check calling, you'll have to bluff later. The idea is that you should just bluff immediately because generally people will bet fold too often after they bet the flop and not 3-bet you much at all. So going for the check raise there with the draw is just going to really grossly overperform. But if you range bet because you're lazy and you want to simplify life for yourself, I think you never really unlock these lines. And you could say, isn't this more trouble than it's worth? Shouldn't we just simplify and play something easy? And my answer to that is no, because this is not a difficult thing. This compartment strategy is hardly advanced. Like once you wrap your head around it, it's pretty easy to just apply it. Thick value, as we've said, on 8-5 deuce, king should probably check raise against the unknown at 50 NL. And the reason for that would just be they're going to overfold dramatically and under raise if you bet. So you're going to get way less value that way, but it's not clear that they understab if you check. So you may well get more value that way. So this is pretty simple, right? I don't really have anything else to say. There are 6 broad compartments that you can place your hands in. And if your opponent's a recreational player at any stake, you might want to adopt this strategy until you know how aggressive or passive they are. And if your opponent's a decent reg, okay, learn some GTO, learn how to play certain strategies, learn how to mix, learn how to simplify to range bet or range check when it's, 80% or 20% c-bet frequency respectively. Do all of those things, but don't do it against fish. Don't do it against 25 NL villains. You're paying enough rake, guys. True EV is about getting you out of the rake trap that is these stakes, and the way to do that is to maximize EV in every single node and not get lazy and not try and make your own life easier. Let's have a look at some hands where we exemplify this compartment strategy. These are 100 Russian Cash Challenge hands, so they're played against bad players for the most part. So this is a good training ground for the compartment strategy. Pocket aces here, we go for an open and small blind. All these hands are going to be of this nature. This is stable showdown value. You might look at this as vulnerable because a spade will ruin your equity. The problem is that when you bet, villain doesn't fold a spade anyway, so it's not like when a spade is coming on the turn that you wish you'd bet the flop. That's a fallacy. So actually in a spot like this, we would place our hand as stable showdown value / value. And while this hand can bet or check in equilibrium, I don't really mind actually on the monotone board because I think people are a bit passive on monotone boards in general. It's maybe like a slight caveat. So here I think the EV of bet and check run a bit closer, but the compartment strategy says go for a check call or check raise depending on villain's sizing. If villain goes too small here, you can check raise this hand even though it would mostly just be check call at equilibrium. The turn is a king, we go for a bet, villain calls, the river is a spade, we check, they check back, they actually hit 2 pair on the turn. We lose that one, but I think a decent example of a hand that's kind of close between buckets there and the monotone texture providing a little bit of an exception to the norm, you could say. 8-6 suited, we go for the open, blind versus blind. This is pretty stable showdown value. This hand is unlikely to be 4th pair or worse by the river, and if you follow that rule, you can therefore just check against the bad player and expect them to bet too wide here. On the turn, again, just giving people rope in this spot where their landing range is basically a million combos is going to be nice. They do go for the bet here. We call. The river's a queen, fully planning on check calling the river here. This is a node where if villain doesn't have a king, they will have very few value bets on the river. Okay, a 7 is unlikely. It's probably going to overstab flop compared to what it's meant to. A king is probably going to overstab flop. A queen might not find the river value bet. So if villain is a weak player here and bets the river, this is a grossly overbluff situation that you just want to be calling in. Villain just gives up the deuce four of spades on this occasion, which is fine. Another example of like getting some EV from a hand that would just fold if we bet the flop for the most part. Okay, you can say that we got lucky that they hit a flush draw and then bricked, but you'll see people bet deuce four of clubs on that turn as well, because they just want to take a shot at it now. And because they're so unrestrained with the stabbing against multiple checks, playing this part of your range passively is just a really good idea. King queen off. We go for an open, villain calls. We actually bet small here because we were against a strong player, or stronger player, I should say. If I was against like an out-and-out recreational on this board, I don't mind exploit checking this hand, even if this board is range bet in GTO. Villain folds, not much to say. Ace 4, we open, we get called. Jack 7-7. This is an example of kind of verging on utter trash. Like the showdown value is a bit too weak here to start check calling. And while that might not be awful, I definitely prefer betting here because it just falls into the unknown opponent at soft pool and we have semi sort of trash here. So we just go for the small C bet, which is the way the compartment strategy tells us to play this part of our range. Villain decides to call and the 5 of clubs comes on the turn. The 5 of clubs is the type of card that doesn't really hit either player much, but what it does do is leave our opponent's range quite capped and leave our nut advantage quite intact. Now, the 7 here is definitely something both players can have on flop. Villain slightly more than we as a proportion of range. By the turn, it's unlikely that they have a 7 now. They've not raised flop. People are quite straightforward in this spot usually. And so I think overbetting the turn is okay here. I think actually I prefer like pot or just under pot. I think this isn't quite the right texture to do this. With the ace of clubs, you know, this is a good card to have. It cleans up your ace outs. It means that you block the continuing range from your opponent, which is going to have some club stuff in it. And therefore, I think going for overbet on this node is going to make some sense, although it may not be the best sizing. This one gets through. King Queen offsuit here. This is a bit of a weird one, because usually this hand is prosperous. Like, it's good enough for the check raise bluff. This flop, however, is getting a little bit horrible. So just going for like a showdown value check call here I think is fine. King Queen does have a fair amount of showdown value on this node. It has more than you might think it does. So we go for check call here instead of check raise, especially when we face a large bet on this texture. Another really important rule in this spot, and you do want to be flexible, you know, just because you think your compartment is usually check raise doesn't mean you will check raise it against all sizes. If villain pots it, you will play really differently to if villain third pots it. And that's because weaker players tend to fall into the trap of bet size equals hand strength on early streets. And it's kind of okay to do that when you're value betting the river. You know, like a thin value hand and a thick value hand probably do want different sizes on the river at equilibrium. But on the flop, you shouldn't really just be taking all of your bad hands and betting small with them and then betting big with all of your good hands. That would be a highly exploitable thing to do. You might do it exploitatively. You shouldn't do it if trying to construct in a rational manner. So in Queen here, we decide to just check call. I think this hand just has too much EV to check fold at this point, especially with the diamond. Without the diamond, I think check fold is reasonable. Goes check check. And the river is a 5. At this point, I expect villain mainly just to have like some ace high. Pairs are unlikely because they're quite accustomed to just betting turn, although you could end up seeing like 4x or 3x or 6s here from time to time. We went for the 2.5x pot. I think this is reasonable against most players. We, of course, have all of the big boats in our range. We have some quads. We have a massive nut advantage, and spots where your nut advantage is just absolutely ginormous like it is here, going for a really big bluff sizing just makes a ton of sense. It's true that we have showdown value on this node as well, but you don't need to give up river. You don't need to check river just because you can win sometimes at showdown. If you think your opponent's folding 93% to the sizing, and I think they probably are folding something like that here, I think the fold equity is astronomically high, then it could be that bluffing a certain sizing yields a higher EV than checking, even though checking is positive. Remember, the goal in poker isn't just to do something that's plus EV, it's to find the highest EV play, and that's why we went for this line here. This did actually get through, I think. Yep. 10-9. We flop it straight. I think check raise is great here. If your opponent is very passive, you might just start by betting big on a texture like this as an exploit. We go for the check. Villain checks back this time. The turn we have a massive hand. We're probably going to start just bombing now. We do overbet, but no action this time. 6-5 we open, and this is the kind of hand that I think check raising is all right with. I will maybe caution slightly that ace high boards are attacked a bit less than some other ones. So just going for the bet here instead of the check raise. I think this makes a ton of sense exploitatively, because if we do face a bet on ace 9-7, it's just not going to be as bluffed and as chaotically stabbed as something like the 8-5 deuce that we looked at earlier, and nor should it be, right? Like, big blind is really incentivized to play a larger sizing with a smaller frequency here and just build more polar right from the get-go on a flop like this. We talk about that a lot in the Carrot Poker School Grade 1 Lecture 8 on float betting, where we outline different sizes and strategies that you should be deploying there in theory. Grade 1 Lecture 8 is a great one to wrap your head around how the composition of your range dictates your sizing compared to your opponent's range and the texture. That one just gets through. So obviously these hands are not like YouTube hands where we're like, look at this amazing fun spot. These are just highly methodical, applying our formula hands. So Jack 3, probably just c-bet. This is a hand that is check folding at a very high clip. Well, not a very high clip, but some clip against different sizes at equilibrium. In real life, you won't get raised enough here. You'll probably get too much fold equity. I'm a fan of just betting a third. Yep, so we do that. You can see that we're following this in the challenge because we're trying to maximize EV, right? So we're not really worried about balance or anything of that nature. We're just playing a strategy that tries to optimize. And it's a simple one. It may not be as simple as betting your whole range, but it's interesting trying to figure this stuff out. Like having a formula that's a little bit more sophisticated and then being able to adapt it based on real table conditions and reads and stuff. That's way more fun than just going, I'm going to bypass this street. I mean, okay, if you just want to grind out like a massive sample and play hardly any exploits on early streets, you can do that, but I do think it curbs your win rate quite considerably, especially in the modern climate where there's high rake. Check raise is fine. Check call isn't terrible either. Bet is okay. Like, this is a spot where I don't actually care that much. The normal default here against an average fish is probably to check raise, but that said, I don't hate it if I bet here, but we do go for the check raise this time, it looks like, and now we just probably go big. Yep, so you can see that when they check back, our general turn plan is to apply a lot of pressure with bluffs and just use big sizes quite a bit in general. Their check back range will be too capped. They will be betting too much of their king X and too much of even their 10x in this sort of pool. You know, the recreational players in this pool are making polarization mistakes like you wouldn't believe. Like, they're literally betting the flop with fives at a really high clip here when you check and stuff like that sometimes. That's why check raise just becomes so good. I've seen people probing the turn against me with like a very pure check ace high on some dry texture, and I just like call a better ace high, and I'm like, why did I get any money from that guy there? I didn't deserve any money in theory, but I just got given a bet in practice. So it's important to give rope to a lot of these players in these spots. So after they call here, I think this is a pretty bad spot to follow through in. There's a little bit of a double-edged sword here. Well, not even a double-edged sword, but it's just like a kind of razor going on here. Let's call it Clarke's razor, which is that if your opponent is a weaker player who calls a turnover bet, they're probably underfolding the river at low stakes. And that's because there's a fight or flight gate that they sort of go through, whereby if they have a 10 on this turn or they have like a 4 on this turn, they're making up their mind as to whether you're bluffing or not. A lot of the time, a weaker player will sometimes think in terms of like, well, does he have it or doesn't he have it? Whereas like a reg will think in terms of, okay, what are my bluff catcher's properties? How many streets can I call? What's my redraw like? What is this node like in general? What does my theory brain tell me? But recreational players are more just like, okay, I either fold because I'm just uncomfortable and I don't like it, or I take a stand. And if they take a stand here, you know, not to mention your blockers are wrong, but probably the river's just really underfolded. So we do give up here. Ace 4, yeah. When that hand calls us on the turn, it's probably with the intention of calling the river a lot more of the time than you might think, because while a solver will go call and then fold, maybe, although I think this is an amazing bluff catcher, you're unblocking all bluffs here because small blind doesn't bluff the river with ace of spades. And you have a card that blocks 2-pair and sets that were hit on the turn. And when you have something like that after flop goes check, check, you block the turn nuts. That's a very good bluff catcher. So in equilibrium, this hand should definitely call the river. In reality, it might not. But the reason it might not is more just that there's a few recreational players out there that do call 1 but not 2. But most people are calling 0 or 2 when your sizing gets really big. If your sizing's small, yeah, their range is going to fall off gradually. But when your sizing's big on the turn, a lot of people make up their mind there and then. So you see like a bunch of fish call turn, call river, and some others just fold turn, and then there's a really small cluster that calls turn, folds river. That's just like, not even MDA, but just like rational psychology. Ace 10 of hearts. I think this is close, but because the texture's horrible, check call is probably the front runner. I don't hate check raise. I don't hate it at all, actually. We do check call this time. Check, check, check the river with ace high. Overbluff spot, bet, check, bet, very overbluff line. We need 30% here. We probably have 35 to 45% here. I don't know exactly how much. Probably a bit under 50% equity, but enough to bluff catch, that's for sure. We do call, and we run into jack 9. It's a good value bet by our opponent. Jack 4, open, call, and this is a horrendous board that we might just check for transparency on. When the board is this ugly, your opponent's going to be in line much more often as a recreational player. So when they have nothing here, like they have 5-6, they're way less likely to attack a repulsive board like Jack 8 Queen two-tone than they are to attack like some random low board. So I think check, call a small bet, fold to a big bet's good here. Just ask villain what they have. Let's keep checking. This is already kind of grim, like when they bet big on this board. I might even fold the turn here. Yeah, I actually did. This is the line I don't normally take, right? Like folding third pair to just one bet, blind versus blind, is usually a no-no. But on a board like this, I just feel like it's really quite hard to aggress here unless you're just betting absolute air. I mean, there are some draws and stuff, of course, as well, like some king x, 10x. I don't know, maybe this is a call, but it feels really fringy to me. The sizing matters as well. A lot of recreational players bet bigger when they have it and smaller when they don't. Exploitatively wide open here with jack deuce, going to check the flop. Going to probably b75 the turn, I would think. And with quads in the river, we're going to go very big. Just hoping to run into like some stubborn boat. King 9, just c-bet. Your hand's not really robust enough to check call or check raise, so you just bet. That just falls into the kind of trash to semi-trash compartment. 3s, probably just bet. This falls into very vulnerable showdown value that while if it goes check, 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 you'll win a fair amount, they will bluff you a bunch here and you won't really be able to continue too effectively on most turn cards. So just start by betting, probably giving up here. I don't hate with the 3 of hearts over betting this turn. I don't think it's ridiculous or anything. It's probably fine. And yeah, we have some showdown here. Because villain's filtered already, this is not going to be a great bluff catch spot. Also because there's no immediate draws available on flop, and we know that people overfold the flop to the small bet. So for that reason, we probably just pitch the river here. Yep. And ace 3, finally, we have a flop of ace 5 deuce. We go for the check because this is very much in the stable showdown value camp. This is also a board which at Equilibrium we don't want to do a ton of betting on. People kind of think this is more of a betting flop than it is. Interesting turn node. I mean, unfortunately our opponent's probably stabbing too wide with an ace on the flop. I wonder if you can check call here and just go for like some trappy line. I don't hate that. Oh, we do go for the check. Love it. Actually proud of myself there. The reason is that there's just very few hands that we win a big pot against now. Like villain can have a flush. They're very unlikely to have two pair or a set or anything, and they're quite unlikely to have like ace 6 plus either, because we know people bet the flop a bit too often with those hands. So I think just letting people bluff here is good. I don't like this raise. I don't know what I'm doing. I should just be calling. This is just a really weak air heavy range, and even if villain does have an ace here, don't think they have to call the check raise or like call the check raise and call river. So this is just a call. Like this is a bad play. But sometimes we mess up. I think we have to do one more hand now and finish on a high. Can't finish on that hand. Like, we got the check right on the turn, but we butchered that. Sometimes in game, you're playing 4 tables, you know, you mess up. It happens, we're human. Try and forgive yourself. Do as I say here, not as I do, because I beat the hell out of myself. King 10 deuce. Probably against a good player. If I'm going third pot, against a bad one, I would check and just let them combust. Kind of uneventful hands. Let's keep going till we get a good one. Here we go. Set. If I'm against a bad player, check raise here. It's really quite attractive. I don't know about this, actually. It's possible that this guy's like very passive and it's just appearing like they're not going to do much investing if I'm betting here, but then I should probably go bigger. Not a fan of the small bet here, actually. Let's try and find a hand I haven't messed up. I think I'd rather bet big or check raise there with that hand against most fish. Queen deuce, just bet. Why are we checking? Sometimes we're just like timing out on multiple tables and mistakes happen. Now we go for the block, which I really like. Okay, so the flop there. Our hand is a bit weak to do anything with if we check, so we should just be betting it against an unknown. If we know the guy's really passive, we could check for transparency and just bet later, but this is the kind of hand we really hate to just check fold against a random fish because we face aggression pretty often. So hopefully that was a useful exercise. Once you start chunking your range into different compartments, you can see what you should be doing with each of them. This is a default strategy. Lots of factors at the table will make you deviate, you know, differences in board texture, differences in reads that you have, stack sizes, all of these things. History with the player in a live game is different again. But yeah, this is a good starting point. To me, this isn't that much more complex than just betting range or checking range, but it's a hell of a lot more accurate against the average recreational, and that's why I wanted to bring it to your attention in this episode of True EV. Thank you so much for subscribing to Clarke Corner, and we'll be back with more episodes in this series very soon. Bye-bye for now.